There's a famous scene from Star Wars Episode 3 where Obi Wan Kenobi is standing on a hill above Anakin Skywalker as the two are fighting, and Obi Wan tells Anakin, "It's over, Anakin. I have the high ground." Now, Obi Wan is physically standing above Anakin, but that isn't the only meaning of the phrase. Having the high ground on a battlefield is considered an advantage. You can see your opponent better and get better lines to fire on them. Groups or individuals that have the high ground typically fare better than those lower down, and when possible, military units will plan battles so they can be even slightly above their opponents to get any advantage that they can. But what about when the high ground isn't physical, but metaphorical? In this instance, we're talking about the moral high ground. Being above your opponent on a moral standing to give yourself an advantage in a debate or an argument. But what is the moral high ground, and is it even important to have? Generally speaking, the moral high ground is important when it comes to winning approval and support in difficult situations. If you can convince enough people that what you are saying is morally right, while your opposition is morally wrong, you can get enough public opinion in your favor and accomplish whatever ends you set out to accomplish. But all of that hinges on one very important thing that is often overlooked in these situations: moral relativity. Before you can even begin to talk about whether something is moral or not, you need to determine the basis from which you are drawing your morals and make sure that base is aligned with the person that you're debating and the people you're trying to convince. As an example, there are religions where eating shellfish is considered immoral. Let's say we're in a survival situation where food is scarce and the only thing available to eat is lobster. If I'm arguing that we shouldn't eat the lobster because eating shellfish is immoral, I'm going to have a hard time convincing a group of people that don't believe in the same moral framework as me to not eat those animals. But that's a rather obscure example, so let's pull something a little more tangible and controversial from the Walking Dead game, specifically the 400 Days DLC. One of the groups in that DLC has made themselves a home in an abandoned gas station. They have food and medicine and a pretty decent security setup with walls and even zombie watchdogs to help keep intruders away. But that security isn't enough to stop one man from trying to steal supplies. The group catches him and has to decide his fate. And this is where different moral frameworks become a problem. Now, the game itself really oversimplifies the whole thing, but we have the chance here to really dig in and explore what to do with the man from several different angles. Let's start with a moral framework based on religious ideas and principles, because I think the vast majority of people tend to view morality, at least partially, through a religious lens. Very basically, most religions would consider murder immoral, and killing the man would be murder as he isn't actively attacking the group. The fact that he's tied up and hasn't tried to physically hurt anyone bolsters this argument. However, many religions also allow for the killing of outsiders, even encouraging the slaughter of innocents who aren't a part of the religious tribe. If everyone in the group shared a common religious view, killing the man could be seen as the morally right thing based on their holy texts. But if one or two people in the group don't share those values, they might argue from their own religious standing, or even from a completely secular standpoint, that killing the man isn't okay. How do we determine who is right? Because humans aren't completely logical creatures, the majority opinion typically carries the moment. Debates, like the discussion about whether to let the man go, kill him, or keep him as a prisoner, typically boil down to emotional arguments, with different people trying to sway the group to their side. The moral high ground is won or lost on being the most persuasive person in the group. From an emotional standpoint, we could argue that the man might have a family somewhere that is relying on him to bring back supplies. Our group might be doing really well, but that doesn't mean that everyone is, And while it's easy to condemn someone for their acts of desperation when we're on this side of things, we need to use empathy to put ourselves in his shoes and realize that we would likely have acted just like he did in a similar situation. Even if he doesn't have a family, he's still a human being and he deserves the rights and dignity that comes with that. None of us is perfect, and he shouldn't be made to pay for the crime of trying to survive in the zombie apocalypse simply because he isn't one of us. On the flip side of that emotional coin, however, the fact that he isn't one of us means that he could be a part of a group that might be a threat to us. What if he has friends waiting on him to return with news of settlements that have food and medicine? There are people out there, even today, that think that the world should be one big survival of the fittest battle, where the laws and institutions are cast aside for a might makes right argument. These people presumably would have formed up together once society had fallen, and would take advantage of any group showing even the slightest willingness to help others or show any mercy. Maybe the man is part of one of those groups, and letting him live would mean having to endure an attack that our group wouldn't be able to fend off without massive casualties. This threat could be enough to sway people one way or the other out of fear. And that fear is the driving force behind the emotional response to situations, especially when it comes to survival. We are less likely to trust strangers out of fear, less likely to allow outsiders in, or to provide help to those who appear to be in need out of fear. Fear is a survival mechanism and one of our biggest threats to logic in many circumstances. Logically, letting the man go makes the most sense from a moral perspective, because he hasn't really harmed anyone, and any one of us would want to be released in the same situation. We know we wouldn't have done anything to harm another group, only stealing if we were really desperate, so it's hard to imagine the man has any worse intentions than we do. Emotionally, though, we want to protect ourselves and our group, and the fear of what could happen if we let him go outweighs any logic that we might bring to the table. But, of course, there are some extenuating factors to consider in these kind of situations. If, for instance, we had plenty of firepower and a strong defensive capability, it would be easier to justify letting him go despite the fear, because even if he had friends, we would see ourselves as strong enough to deal with whatever they might throw our way. Jumping for a moment into the world of Red Dead Redemption, we can see this calculation play out as Arthur Morgan wanders the world, coming across various threats to his person and dealing with them as they come, as we would expect a tough outlaw to do. You might come across a woman lying on the side of the road begging for help, only to have her and her friends start shooting when you get too close. On the other hand, she might actually be in need of help, rewarding you with money or treasure for giving her a lift. Arthur is more than capable of handling himself in any situation, so the fear that would usually cause someone to avoid both situations doesn't factor into his decision-making. And we can even see this in the real world in the form of people asking for help next to a broken-down car, or throwing their thumb in the air to ask passers-by for a ride. We've all heard stories about the kind of person who stopped to help, only to be robbed or killed by the person pretending to need it. How many times have you seen someone on the side of the road, their flashers on, looking disheveled, and decided to pass by because you were worried about who they really might be? Logically, we know that the chances of the person having ill intent are actually really low, and we would want someone to stop for us. But unless we are confident in our ability to handle the person should things go bad, we try to stay as far away as possible. So, fear keeps us alive and overrides the logical side of our brain. So does that mean that the moral high ground is meaningless? If we can convince people based on fear, why even bother worrying about morals? Because fear isn't a long-term solution, and we can't build a functioning society that lasts on the basis of fear. Maybe we could justify killing the intruder in 400 days because he might be a threat given our group's lack of defensive capabilities, but in the long run, we're going to have to be able to defend ourselves and trust other groups if we want a better future. If we build our community on the foundation of fear, will never grow and will likely perish a lot sooner than if we had built it on a strong moral and logical foundation. Those foundations are where we get ideas like the rule of law and equal treatment under the law. But the gas station community in 400 Days is small and not very organized at the end of the day. So what about a larger community? Let's look at something like Crawford from the end of Season 1. Crawford was a community that sprang up as the world was collapsing, using a spot in Savannah known as Crawford Square as its origin point. It was run by a man named Crawford Oberson, and on the surface, it seems like a strong group at first. But that attempt at a new society was built on fear, as we can see from the rules they put in place. The first principle they have on their list is all illnesses and medical conditions must be disclosed to the council. At first glance, this would seem to be a measure put in place to ensure that they had enough medical supplies and could scavenge what was needed based on the needs of the community. And that might be how it was introduced. Over time, however, this rule would cause those who experienced any health issues a lot of fear as they saw others being thrown out and even killed for being diabetic, getting pregnant, or having a variety of other medical conditions. And that fear would manifest as members of the group started hiding their activities, unsure of who they could trust. What if the person you thought was a friend went to the council and told them that you were sick and you were thrown out? The second principle, children under 14 not admitted without authorization, is another that would bring fear to families who had children that fit that criteria. They aren't blanket banning children, they are banning them without authorization. What this means in practice is that the council might allow you and your family to be a part of the community, but there is always the implied, and potentially even explicit, threat that the authorization for your child could be revoked. Imagine a council member with kids, who maybe was only allowed to keep their family together because they were friendly with the right people. But the moment that they disagree with the decision the council wants to make, they find that authorization in jeopardy. It's a control mechanism that would be incredibly useful to those in power. The third principle, anyone asked to leave Crawford cannot return under any circumstances, reinforces the first two by constantly reminding people of what's at stake. If you want to step out of line, go against the status quo, you could find yourself out of Crawford with no chance to return. The fear of being out in the world without access to a reliable supply of food and medicine would be enough to keep a lot of people in line. The fourth principle, theft or looting within the district will not be tolerated, is another that seems pretty straightforward, but has an implicit layer of fear that could easily be missed on a general reading. We could easily make a case to outlaw theft, with looting falling in the same general category. But the wording, will not be tolerated, implies harsh consequences for those accused of theft, and provides an avenue for intimidation when it comes to how supplies are handed out. Maybe I know that you need some medicine that you don't want anyone to know about, like prenatal vitamins. Or maybe I can help you by giving you more food than I'm supposed to, and then turn around and say that you stole it if you don't do something I ask of you. Or perhaps I don't even need to do any of that, only needing to accuse you of theft to get you thrown out because I don't like you and I've got a friend or two on the council. Again, fear is used to control and manipulate. The final principle, waste not, make the most of your rations, kind of falls in the same category, but it's more in line with trying to make the supplies the community has last. Being important enough to add it to the list implies that it is something you can get thrown out for, making it similar to the previous principle as far as threats go, but it isn't really anything new per se. What is a little more striking to me, though, is what's left off the list. There's nothing about murder or rape or anything else related to bodily harm of another, and that just seems really odd. They took the time to list the second principle, for instance, banning those under 14 without authorization, but banning murder wasn't important enough to make the list? And you can't really say that murder is so obvious that it doesn't need to be on the list because they took the time to list theft and looting, two others that should be obvious as well. What it really is that Crawford wanted residents to be afraid of being thrown out for minor violations because fear is the easiest way to control people. There's no reason to list things like murder because most people aren't going to be inclined to kill their neighbors, and killing someone leaves a body that makes the act really obvious. Whereas the other things could all be used as leverage to keep people in line without any crime actually needing to be committed. But a society based on fear is doomed to fail because the heightened sense of dread and mistrust that kind of environment creates isn't sustainable for a social species that relies on trust to survive. Fear can be a tool to make people aware of a problem that needs to be addressed, but it isn't a good foundation for a society. And time again, we see groups fall because they base their foundations on fear. The group at House Hardware in Season 2 did this as well, with the fear of being punished, thrown into a makeshift prison and having your freedom taken away, being used to control people. If you did anything Carver didn't like, you would be thrown into the yard and forced to do the work that no one else wanted to do. The New Frontier in Season 3 uses fear as a tool as well, but they're a little better organized. They at least have some form of a justice system, despite the corruption that seeps into the leadership council in the end. That group deserves a whole video on their own at some point. So the question that we should be focusing on then is how do we overcome fear when it stands in the way of things like building a society in the zombie apocalypse, or even when it clouds logical decision making in situations like the group in 400 Days faces? The most important thing that we can do is make sure that we have all the available facts about a situation before moving toward a decision. I deliberately failed to mention earlier that one of the biggest problems the group in 400 Days faced with the man that they captured was that he didn't speak English. This made communication extremely difficult and meant that he couldn't even answer any questions they had about his intentions or origin. In that situation, they know that he was trying to steal food and medicine, and that he was on his own when they caught him, and that he doesn't speak their language. They also know their own defensive capabilities, and they know what they have to lose. Outside of that, they have no way of knowing what will happen following the decision to let the man go or to kill him. They might not ever see him again. He might return with friends and kill them all. They might not be able to handle taking the man's life as a group and fall apart, or they might not have any problem with it at all and be more willing to take the life of the next potential threat without even questioning it. Keeping him alive as a prisoner comes with its own set of risks, as, if he is with the group, they might come looking for him. It's a struggle between the individual and the group, with each person having their own moral compass and tolerance for risk that either aligns with or goes against the overall moral compass and risk tolerance of the group as a whole. So, how should the group at the gas station have handled the man? First off, they should have had a plan for dealing with outsiders and especially potential thieves well before the man showed up. They talk about how this man is the second one to go after the supplies, and how the last person to steal things would have gotten away if not for their own infighting. So there should have been some kind of discussion after that at a minimum. They also should have agreed on some kind of moral system, laying down what everyone was okay with and establishing lines they weren't willing to cross well before the point that we find them at. We see them argue about what should be done, with some very clear lines being drawn in the moment. But all of that should have been hashed out well before catching an intruder. Personally, I would have pushed to lay down a set of rules based on humanist principles when the group first formed. The basis of those rules would be to focus on things that maximize and prioritize the well-being of the group. Using that system, we could lay out a framework for handling intruders, including some kind of trial system and taking into account any defense they might have for themselves and their actions. Under that system, we would have to do our best to communicate with him to try to figure out his intentions. making the final decision over the course of a few days of discussion rather than right away. This would also allow tempers to settle, maybe giving him a chance to open up to the best of his ability, and giving everyone the chance to really think about the decision. Additionally, if he does have friends who come looking for him, having him alive and being able to hand him back over to them could be in our group's best interest. If no one comes looking for him and no new information comes to light regarding his intentions or goals that would help his case, the best option would be to execute him, as we have to put our group first and protect our people. Using a bunch of resources on him at the risk of our own people suffering would not be acceptable, and the risk of him bringing back a group is too high. Maybe they don't come looking for him, but maybe he goes back to them with information that gets people in our group killed. To me, this risk is just not worth it. Allowing a balance of having a trial and weighing all of the outcomes and thoughts of the groups gives us a firm moral ground to stand on, and it's something that can be applied both to external as well as internal threats. You might not get everyone to agree with the final decision, but basing that final decision on something more solid than fear makes it likely to be acceptable even to those who disagree. Normally, I would ask you to comment below and tell me which decision you made, but today I want to ask you to comment on the why. It's important to really examine our thought process and figure out the reasoning behind our decisions, because flawed reasoning leads to bad conclusions a lot more often than it leads to good results. Using games like this as thought experiments allows us to learn more about how we think in a safe environment so that we can make better choices in the real world and ultimately leave this life better than we found it. If you made it this far, tell YouTube and me that you enjoyed the video by hitting the thumbs up button, and subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. I'm trying to make philosophy more accessible and enjoyable to a wider swath of people who might otherwise find it dry and boring. And when you interact through liking, subscribing, and commenting, you help push my videos further out into the world and help more people find the channel. If you want to help support what I do here, while getting cool perks like early access to videos and your name on the screen, you can head over to Patreon or sign up for a membership right here on YouTube. Members and patrons help make all of this possible. For now, I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.